Well, good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome everybody to this online session in which we're going to be talking about 45V, which is pretty much the crux of how hydrogen and the hydrogen industry is going to work in the US. My guess is that today we have a lot of guests from, of course, the United States, but also from elsewhere. So excuse me with my microphone there. First and foremost, I'd like to invite you all to introduce yourselves using the chat. Please say your name, your company, and also where you are connecting from today. And I'm going to begin by introducing myself. My name is Belén Gallego, and I am based in Spain. I'm from the RENMAT by ATA Insights team, and we follow pretty much the hydrogen markets around the world with a very special focus, of course, in the US and in Europe. So we would just like to welcome you all, and hopefully it will be a session in which you will learn a great deal about what's going on in the US. So first, as you know, there was this draft coming out where it will tell us how hydrogen and this $3 subsidy was going to be paid, as we saw in the Inflation Reduction Act. And it came out in December. And the crux of all of this is really 45V, which is what describes, what is going to be considered the decarbonized hydrogen or the hydrogen that is worth this $3 subsidy. In any case, don't worry, I'm not going to be the one talking about this today. I have three experts that are going to be talking about it. But in the next hour, you're going to hear from them, and they will get into a little bit more into detail into what is going on in this regard. So first, I'd like to ask them to introduce themselves. So please, Tessa, if you could take your mute off and introduce yourself so people can get to know you a little bit.
Hi, everybody. Pleasure to be here. My name is Tessa Weiss. I'm a senior associate with RMI. RMI is a global clean energy think tank where we work to accelerate the clean energy transition. I focus specifically on hydrogen and industrial decarbonization.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tessa. So Tessa is going to be talking, but also we're going to hear from Tanya. Please, Tanya, if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tanya Peacock, and I lead the hydrogen practice for EcoEngineers. EcoEngineers is an environmental consulting firm based in Des Moines, Iowa, and but with offices around the world. And I am located in Los Angeles, and then I'm also chair of the California Hydrogen Business Council. So very nice to be with you all here today.
Thank you, Tanya. And last but most certainly not least, Matt, please, if you could introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, my name is Matt Kotarbinski. I am a policy analyst at NREL. I'm based out of the Wind Hybrids Group, and a lot of the work that I'm doing is integrating IRA policy into techno-economic analysis and understanding what that could mean for industrial decarbonization. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the three of you. So basically, we're going to hear today three presentations in this order, okay? And then we're going to take questions. How do you send the questions? You can send the questions through the Q&A box at the bottom, or if you're in YouTube, just put them in the chat for us, and I'll make sure my colleagues who you can't see, but they're there, they'll put it in the chat room for us so that we know, to answer your questions. So whether you are in Zoom or you are in YouTube, we'll get to your questions at the very end. And just to remind everyone that we are recording this session and that we're going to send you the recordings and also the materials that you see on screen later. So without further ado, so I'm going to ask Lucia if you could, or actually I think she told that is sharing the screen, if you can take the screen off now. And I'm going to ask Tessa if you can prepare your screen and remind everyone that, of course, understanding now how these subsidies, so depending on decarbonization work, is really where it's at. And I think there is great amount of interest from everyone around the world of how it's going to work, because not only it affects the US and the hydrogen produced in the US, but a lot of other countries are using this sort of model to use in their own countries. So go right ahead, Tessa, with your presentation.
Wonderful, thank you. I will be talking us through what the proposed guidance is for the 45V clean hydrogen tax credits and what some of the implications are, both opportunities and challenges that this may provide for hydrogen projects and markets. So the Inflation Reduction Act, which was signed into law in 2022, established the 45V Clean Hydrogen Production Tax Credit as an emissions tier credit for the production of hydrogen. And the lowest emitting hydrogen production will receive access to the highest value of tax credits. The statute clarifies that well-to-gate life cycle emissions will determine this credit value. And why this guidance that we're here talking about today is necessary is given the complexity of evaluating life cycle greenhouse gas emissions associated with different hydrogen production pathways. And the guidance is attempting to provide a clarification of how can we ensure that both direct and indirect emissions are addressed for projects seeking qualification to these different emissions tiered thresholds of the production tax credit. A few overarching reflections on the proposed rules. So it defines what a well-to-gate life cycle emission standard is for low carbon hydrogen. It ensures that the energy attribute certificates that we currently see for grid connected systems are enabled to be used for hydrogen production pathways. And that's something to be noted in that it opens up a diversity of contract types for electrolytic hydrogen production pathways where they can seek to become grid connected and qualify for the tax credits. However, the EECs must demonstrate incrementality, deliverability, and temporal matching if they are to qualify. Within the guidance, there are ways that developers can propose new hydrogen production pathways in order to provide an alternative to what the GREET model, which is the kind of overarching life cycle emissions model that must be used to quantify the emissions of your hydrogen production pathways. If your hydrogen production process is not within GREET, you're able to still provide a recommendation of what the emissions are and what the production process look like to qualify. Treasury is asking for multiple comments on particularly gas-based production pathways using biomethane and fugitive methane, as most of their recommendations are providing clarification to electrolytic hydrogen production processes, but there's still an open door of how do gas-based production pathways that are within the bounds of those emissions, how do we ensure that they are reducing their well-to-gate life cycle emissions in accordance. So incrementality, the rule here is that new clean electricity must be placed in service less than 36 months prior to the clean hydrogen production facility being placed in service. There is a 3-year grace period, meaning that new clean electricity that has been added to the grid within the past 3 years can be leveraged for hydrogen production. This creates a flexibility in the sense that there is an immediately accessible pool of qualifying clean electricity that can be leveraged for hydrogen production. The intent of this incrementality rule at large is to ensure that as we start to build out new loads to the grid that are going to be drawing a significant amount of power, that we are building out new clean power proportional to the power that we are drawing to ensure that we're promoting deep decarbonization of our grid alongside building out more and more loads on the grid. A few questions that Treasury is seeking guidance on is, are there flexibilities regarding, can we allow 5% of existing clean power to qualify as incremental? How do we deal with curtailment of clean electricity? Should we treat grids with higher penetration of renewables differently than other grids? And then how do we ensure a method of qualification for existing facilities in the early days of the credit? These rules ensure that, as I alluded to earlier, that we're contributing to deep decarbonization of our grid. And it does provide a way that kind of within projects coming online now can access immediately qualifying electricity that has been online for the past 3 years. And that is a flexibility that we see in the market that can perhaps be advantageous in getting projects off of the ground. So temporal matching. By January 1st, 2028, projects must match clean electricity and hydrogen production on the hourly level. And there is a period up until 2028 that allows projects to not be temporally matched, that they may be annually matched and can move towards hourly matching in time. There are outstanding questions Treasury has regarding how do certain hours of the year be accounted for. Say you miss tracking 1 hour, does that negate your entire qualification for the credit entirely? How do we deal with a question of battery storage? In the question of hourly matching at large, will battery electric storage qualify under an hourly matching regime? As well as to what extent will we be able to build out the data and virtual infrastructure that will support establishment of hour by hour quantification and tracking of clean electricity? So RMI, we've done some analysis looking at to what extent that the movement towards hourly matching starting in 2028 compared to annual matching can help ensure that emissions are being reduced. And across multiple different shapes of the market, one in which is dominated more by electrolytic hydrogen production and one that's dominated more through gas-based production modes, we see that there is significant emission savings over the lifetime of hydrogen supply in the United States through having an hourly matching. And this is really the crux of why Treasury is likely thinking about an hourly match, is to ensure that we're moving towards development and production of low carbon hydrogen as we start to build out a low carbon hydrogen ecosystem. Deliverability. So the final pillar requires that all new clean electricity must be located within the same deliverability zone as indicated by the DOE transmission study on this map to the right. And if you're going to be building out new clean electricity to offset the electricity that you're drawing, it must be located within the same region. They're seeking question to if these are the right regions that should be used, or are there other ways to prove deliverability besides just this geographic co-location of supply with demand. So to move away from what the guidance says and towards what are some of the opportunities that the guidance as proposed creates for hydrogen markets, is one, broadly, it will start to accelerate the development of clean hydrogen markets by clarifying compliant business models, expanding the pool of eligible projects, and unlocking access to immediate and secure offtake markets found in Europe. We have found that over the past several years, since the announcement of the hydrogen production tax credits, there has been substantial interest in building out clean hydrogen supply within the United States. However, the lack of clarity on how a project must operate and how it must be built has largely hindered the advancement of these projects to FID, and the market has stalled at large. So by clarifying the rules in which projects must be operating under will enable projects to advance towards FID. We also see that through the allowance of these energy attribute credits that unlock the ability for a grid-connected project to qualify, it expands the diversity of contract types as well as business models that will be compliant. So now an electrolysis project can be seeking grid connection as opposed to just needing to be developed behind the meter. And that opens up a set of flexible business models in different locations than may have been previously seen for hydrogen production. We also see, and maybe most importantly as a mechanism for building out early hydrogen markets, is the alignment with what we see with Europe. So the harmonization of the standards between the United States and Europe is going to allow the rich supply potential within the United States, motivated by the low-cost production that we see from the hydrogen production tax credits, to service the immediate and secure demand pools within the European market. So Europe has strong goals by 2030 to have 10 million metric tons of hydrogen imported alongside 10 million metric tons of domestic production. All potential importers to Europe must be compliant with their definitions of renewable hydrogen. Their definitions of renewable hydrogen we see on this light teal bar above, and they very much match what the US has put in place for their clean hydrogen compliance for these tax credits. So that in and of itself will enable the supply potential within the US to unlock access to these immediate markets in Europe. And one of the challenges that we've seen within the United States market is, although that there are these wealth of supply side incentives to build out hydrogen production and markets, there's really no equal pool to mandate the adoption of demand. And most is being motivated by, well, can clean hydrogen production compete on an economic basis? And there's much more that goes into enabling an off-taker transition to hydrogen than just the economics, right? It's thinking about, do we have the supporting infrastructure for one? And can we build out the contract structures over the long time horizons that off-takers require to start to match supply with demand, with the assurance of volumes of supply and consistency of supply that they need. We're seeing that within the Gulf region, a lot of these early projects that are being proposed and kind of almost most immediately ready to move to FID are seeking entrance to the European market. And if we can start to build out this supply to Europe, that can have a catalytic effect for some of these other offtake sectors, say within the US or globally, and that will start to mature hydrogen supply chains, which can start to bring costs down and make clean hydrogen more cost competitive for a wider set of off-takers, and kind of lessening that impact that we may see of lesser demand side incentives in the US, given it will be able to be more cost competitive. Some of the challenges that we will see that these proposed guidance create for projects is it really does emphasize the need for flexibility throughout your hydrogen production process as well as your offtake process. It will intensify a need for hydrogen storage, as well as elevate the need for hydrogen pipelines and interregional transmission of molecules. So to dive into the first point of heightening the need for flexibility within your system, in a world where we're matching on an hour-by-hour basis our supply of electricity with our production of hydrogen, you need an electrolyzer that can flexibly match that variable input of electricity. This is something to be aware of in how we start to build out supply chains within the United States and kind of incentivize innovation that may be needed for some of the more flexible electrolyzer types, such as a chem electrolyzer rather than an alkaline electrolyzer, to ensure that we are making them cost competitive and less so reliant on some of these rare earth metals that might be limiting to the overall rate of scale that these flexible electrolyzer types may see. We also see broadly within a project that if you're producing your hydrogen on an hourly basis, right, only when you have the variability of solar and wind, that may be at a mismatch to when we want to deliver hydrogen to an off-taker. For example, a chemicals facility or a steel manufacturer, oftentimes they need high volumes of hydrogen consistently throughout the year. So if we're producing our hydrogen flexibly, we need to be storing hydrogen in order to provide that consistent supply to an off-taker. And that is something that is going to be elevated as a central importance, both of where we start to see supply emerge throughout the US, as well as a central tenet of how a integrated hydrogen production and delivery system needs to be operated, is we need to be thinking about ways to gain access to these low cost and bulk hydrogen storage facilities, such as salt cavern storage. We then move to thinking about some of the challenges that deliverability constraint may provide and how we can move energy throughout the United States. And that if you're only able to produce and use hydrogen within that same region based off of those if you're only able to produce clean electricity within that same region where you want to be producing that hydrogen, if you have hydrogen demand that is located elsewhere, you're no longer able to bring those electrons outside of that region. You need to be thinking about moving that hydrogen between regions. And so this will elevate a need to start to build out interregional transport to unlock some of these low-cost renewable energy centers that we have throughout the United States and bring them to where we have demand, as oftentimes they are not in the same region today. Broadly, though, what we see is that if these are elements that will impact and motivate the types of business models that are competitive for early projects, but by no means are they a stop to the development of hydrogen at large. Things that are going to hold back development of hydrogen production and in the market is similar to what we see for clean energy development at large. And so ensuring that we can tackle challenges such as grid congestion and transmission constraints, tackle permitting challenges that occur between state lines, thinking about developing an hourly digital tracking infrastructure that can make this a seamless transition. Nothing is inherently problematic to getting hydrogen off of the ground, from my opinion. I think it's more about being aware of the impacts that this will have on how projects and how markets can be developed, so we can be intentional in building out supply chains as needed and building out the set of additional enabling factors to promote the development of clean electricity and clean hydrogen at large. With that, that is all I have for you today, and I will pass it to Tanya.
Thank you, Tessa.
Thank you very much, Tessa. Yeah, go right ahead, Tanya. A lot of food for thought in here. Right, and there are a lot of little questions and things, and we have a bunch of questions if you want to take a look. Which we'll answer them at the end, but go right ahead, Tanya, if you want to share your screen. It's very complex, all of the supply chain, the whole thing, it's very, very complex. Go right ahead.
Okay, so as Tessa mentioned, determining how to measure the carbon intensity of hydrogen is one of the central points of the proposed guidance. So what I'm going to do is just dig in a little bit here on, what is a life cycle analysis or an assessment? Those terms are sometimes used interchangeably. What's involved with conducting a study, and this, of course, is important because in order to access the 45V tax credit for the production of qualified hydrogen, the producer has to submit an application that includes a life cycle analysis. So what is an LCA? It is it's a systematic and fact-based analysis of the potential environmental impacts associated with products or services during their entire life cycle. So we'll talk a little bit more about the system boundaries, because that's a very key question with LCAs and the steps involved. But it's really looking at products or services from a life cycle environmental impact perspective. And for 45V, of course, the focus is on life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. To determine the tax credit eligibility, you need to estimate a carbon intensity score. And the LCA studies that will be relevant for 45V follow the ISO 14040 and 14044 standards, and those are part of the 14,000 environmental management family. So within those standards, there's some other standards like 14067, which focuses on the carbon footprint and provides a little bit more specificity around global warming potential, which is its own impact category. And then there's a question, so why do you do an LCA? So of course, the tax credit, but it can also, or maybe it's even a part of a pathway application for a regulatory program like California's low carbon fuel standard. And LCAs can also be used as part of a business's decision-making process to compare existing products with alternatives, all from an environmental impact perspective. And they also can be used to inform and educate external stakeholders, for example, policymakers, investors. We do a lot of work with investors who are interested in an independent assessment of the carbon intensity of the fuel most often, or the product that's being produced. And an LCA can also help support products claims. So if you're trying to claim that your product has 30% less packaging than another one, an LCA will allow you to determine if that's true. And it also allows you to identify environmental hotspots in a product's life cycle. And so you can make adjustments. So we do a lot of work with producers who have a target CI, which is for hydrogen, to come in below 0.45 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. And doing a preliminary LCA can help understand where the hotspots are and how to make choices in the design before you're actually putting steel in the ground to achieve the target CI. So this is just really just like a very high level mini tutorial on what is an LCA. So there are 4 main steps to an LCA, but it is not a linear process at all. And this is kind of where you get into the art and the science of LCA modeling. So, but where do you start? The scope is always where you want to start, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You're trying to determine, in order to answer the questions, you have to clearly determine the questions that you're looking to answer. And then you can figure out the functional unit and the system boundaries. And then from that point, you figure out what the data that you're going to need to build the inventory. And a lot of that will be determined by the modeling tool that you use. So with respect to 45V, it's very clear that the model is going to be the argon-grete hydrogen model. And the guidance describes the kind of data that you're going to need to enter versus, so in the model, there's some background data, and then there's data you can enter that's project specific. The background data can't be changed. So those are some default values that are in there. But if your feedstock and your production technology are not one of the 8 pathways that are included in the recent model update, then there is a process called, then you're going to have to file for a provisional emissions rate from DOE. And I can talk more about that later if people have questions. So once you build your inventory, then you can move to the impact assessment, which is where you put the emissions factors and the emissions data associated with the inventory, and then you can start to generate results. And then comes the interpretation stage. And this is where you can go back and assess where your hotspots are, identify areas for reductions, examine your assumptions. And it's really a very iterative process, because as you go through the goal and scope, if you know you have the goal right, but the results from the impact assessment are different from what you had expected, or you realize that they're not really that meaningful and they're not telling you what you're looking for, then you can go back to the drawing board and you can reconsider various inputs and look for improvement opportunities. So a little bit more detail about the first and arguably the most important step, which is defining the goal and scope, because that's what really determines how you're going to proceed with the entire analysis. So I'm going to walk through an example so in the goal and scope, you're going to want to include the reason you're conducting the LCA. So for the 45V tax credit, it's pretty clear. You want to estimate the amount of CO2 that's being generated per kilogram of hydrogen produced, so that you can make sure that you're certainly under the 4 kilogram limit. And ideally, if possible, you want to be below 0.45 to get the maximum value, the $3 per kilogram. And you're also going to have to determine the production pathway, including the feedstock and the technology that you're going to be assessing. 45V is technology agnostic, but as I mentioned before, there are some limitations to the GREET tool itself, meaning that there are 8 defined pathways and there's pre-programmed background information. And it's the argon-GREET model that's going to be required. And every tax year, it's anticipated that there'll be a new model coming out, and you have to use the most recent model for that year's tax credit application. So next, a key part of the goal and scope process is establishing the system boundary. Often when talking about a life cycle assessment, there's this term called cradle to grave. And that means looking at everything that's upstream of the process. And in some cases, that means going as far back as the extraction and the transportation of the raw materials, all the energy and the other inputs to the production process are included as well. So in some studies, depending upon the scope, transportation of the product to the end use and any other end user emissions and disposal are included. And so that's the broadest scope of an LCA when you want to look at every aspect of the entire life cycle of a product. In some cases, maybe it's just you're going to conduct a gate-to-gate study, which is kind of the equivalent of scope 1 and scope 2 emissions at a facility. And increasingly, we are looking at scope 3 emissions. And so that means all of the emissions associated with the use of a project. So of a product, if we're going to use those scope 1, 2, and 3 terms. So now I'm going to dig in to a specific 45V system boundary example. And this is looking at the production of hydrogen via steam methane reformation. So again, what's the goal? The goal is to determine the life cycle of greenhouse gas emissions of the hydrogen. In terms of the boundaries, the guidance is clear that it's well to gate, meaning that the various upstream inputs to the point of production are included. And this means emissions associated with feedstock gathering, extraction, processing, and delivery of those inputs to the production facility. It also includes all the emissions associated with the hydrogen production process, including the electricity that's used by the facility. And then if there is a carbon capture, if there's carbon capture technology that's included, those emissions are included as well. There has been some confusion or questions about whether or not the oftentimes hydrogen is transported in a liquefied state. And so is the energy used to liquefy hydrogen, is that included? Should that be included in the boundaries? So while the guidance isn't super clear about that, it does state that the functional unit is 1 kilogram of pure hydrogen at a pressure of 300 psi. And it's also referred to as a gas in the process. So we take that, we're interpreting that to mean that the liquefaction emissions will not be included in the CI score to deliver eligibility for the credit. Also, it's important to note that the guidance states that hydrogen will be normalized for the purposes of determining carbon intensity to 300 psi. So that means if your facility generates hydrogen at a pressure that's above or below 300 psi, they'll estimate the amount of electricity to get it to 300 psi. So that's the hydrogen example. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, there's, LCAs are an art as well as a science, and there are lots of decisions that are being made throughout the process that really going to impact the results. From determining what the system boundary is, to analyzing all the inputs and outputs, and deciding what's actually relevant. There's also the question of co-products. A lot of hydrogen production processes produce other products that have a market value. And there's some question about how you allocate emissions correctly to the co-products versus the hydrogen. So the guidance does currently recommend using the system expansion approach to the co-products. And what that means is looking at what the co-product is replacing in the marketplace that could have been produced using a more energy and emissions intensive process. And with fuels, usually it's an energy-based allocation approach where you just allocate the emissions to the different products based on the energy content of that product. And as Tessa mentioned, there is a comment period that's going on active right now, and Treasury is taking comments on this. So on the issue of co-products, but a lot of broader issues are part of the rulemaking as well about how best to quantify the carbon intensity of hydrogen. Of course, the materials and the energy sources chosen by project developers can have a huge impact on CI score. And as we've discussed, there are 8 pathways that are currently in the hydrogen GREET model, but there are several feedstocks and technologies that are not included yet, and hopefully will be included in future versions. For example, the only biomethane feedstock that's included right now is landfill gas. So that leaves out wastewater, any type of animal manure, diverted organic waste, and other biogenic feedstocks. I mentioned earlier that, for any technologies or feedstocks that aren't included, petitions can be filed, and that's a provisional emissions rate process, and the exact process has not yet been released. It should be in the next several months, but it's going to be doing a life cycle analysis and requesting that provisional emissions rate from DOE. So while the guidance, also as Tessa mentioned, while the guidance is very clear for the use of for electrolytic hydrogen and the use of energy attribute credits, for RNG, they asked a lot of questions. I think there are 12 questions or so in the package. So a lot yet to be decided in that area. And I would encourage you, I would encourage lots of participation, particularly from project developers, to write in and just talk about how, what's been your experience of trying to, work with the proposed regulations and get your project built, because it's all part of this process of crafting workable regulations that have environmental integrity. So with that, I will pass it over to Matthew. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. So far, I just have more and more questions, although you guys have managed to answer some of the things that I had there in store. There is a ton of questions, so if you guys want to start, some of them I've marked because I'd like to do them live, but feel free the other ones if you want to get started. And Matt, go right ahead with your presentation.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm going to be presenting from an analysis perspective. Both Tessa and Tanya gave a lot of excellent insights. There might be some synergies between those presentations and mine, so I'll make sure just to kind of sprinkle in some more supplementary information. But yes, so at NREL, we do a lot of analysis, and so I'm based in the Wind Hybrid Systems group, and so a lot of the projects that we're looking at is industrial decarbonization. And so what I'll be doing is presenting from that perspective, which tends to align more so from like a plant operator and developer perspective, just to understand like the techno-economic feasibilities of developing such projects. Here's the agenda that I'll cover. The first half already has been essentially kind of covered really well in the first 2 presentations, so I'll just add some more information from those. Excuse me. Yeah. So, another thing I'd like to add about one of the goals of this proposed guidance, it's to essentially help avoid indirect emissions for grid connected facilities. Within NREL, we do a lot of different analysis looking at different use cases and plant configurations to understand what could work, what doesn't, and understanding the economics behind that, as well as even understanding the emissions footprints as well. And so what we're looking at is understanding grid connected and non-grid connected facilities from that perspective of using hydrogen as a catalyst to unlock decarbonization pathways. So you can see in this image here, this is from the H2 at Scale project, but this kind of essentially just gives you a more thorough understanding of how does hydrogen kind of fit into the concept of decarbonization, both for meeting the 2035 electrification targets in the US, as well as the 2050 net neutral decarbonization targets as well. So EACs have already been covered. I always like to describe these as essentially kind of virtual paper trails, or a receipt, if you will. They are these legal instruments that represent the exclusive claim to an electron that was produced, and it's inclusive of renewable energy certificates as well as other certificates from other broader sets of generation types. What's great about EACs is they also provide a lot of other detailed information that kind of follows that concept of ensuring that there isn't any indirect emissions built on. So it provides information that could include time and location of generation, type of generation, and fuel source, as well as the age of the generator itself, to kind of ensure that it falls within that 3-year window, whether it's new feedstock generation sources or uprated. And the requirements for the EACs do lead into those 3 pillars of additionality, deliverability, and time matching. So just kind of adding more, just kind of more from a analysis perspective, additionality right now is being explored to be satisfied through new feedstock electricity or through uprated. And so, as has been covered, you have that 3-year window for new electricity generation, and then uprated, it's where the facility's nameplate capacity is increased within that 3-year window. And so, although, we're working in this kind of ambiguous time right now with the proposed guidance and really understanding what will be the official ruling, we've heard that, new capacity gained from uprating could potentially satisfy the additionality requirement. So that delta between before uprating and after is potentially being explored as a way that will satisfy that requirement. There are 3 other interesting approaches that are being explored as well. And so one of them is looking at if facilities that are planned to being decommissioned, if they can continue to operate so that they can allocate the electrons to H2 production facilities. That's being another way is additionality being satisfied. Another way is looking to understand if the H2 process would not increase grid emissions or only minimally. So this really fits into the idea of avoiding curtailment of clean energy if it's not being used. And then the third one here is also exploring if 5 or up to 10% of existing generation could be considered as incremental to satisfy that requirement. And so one of the other comments that's being requested is what other clean power generators should be considered. For the second pillar, which is the deliverability, I won't go too much into details here as it's been covered. But I guess the only other question that I could add is that transmission between different regions is also being explored, if that should be considered as well. Regarding time matching or temporal matching, also has been covered. It's essentially looking at if annual time matching should be allowed up until the end of 2027, and then January 1st, 2028, pivoting into an hourly time matching. And I believe the understanding there is that by that point, there will be technologies and methods that will provide really good accountability for ensuring that EACs do have this tracking system. As you can see here, this is actually a photo from the Flatirons campus of NREL, which is in between Boulder and Golden. And you can see there that there is a, so to speak, an off-grid pilot demonstration project that has a lot of different components to it, one of which is a hydrogen component. So it's really cool to see that from the office that is really close by, and actually seeing this happen in real time is really cool. So something that I want to cover more so from an analysis perspective is some of these definitions and some of the clarity. So within the proposed guidance, there's been more clarity around what a facility is defined as, which is a single production line. And so what this single production line includes, it's all the components required to successfully produce H2 independently. That does not include any of the transmission or distribution materials or supplies downstream from the facility. And it also doesn't include any of the operational equipment, such as your wind turbines, your solar, your battery, upstream from the H2 production process. This photo down here is the same facility that we have on the Flatirons campus, just from the other perspective. And so you can see here, there's the different sectors. Now, you could define this as an off-grid facility, but to follow this single production line definition, each one of these components is its own independent element that would potentially be eligible or not for all the various tax incentives, including 45V. Another one that I wanted to talk about is the anti-abuse ruling. And the anti-abuse ruling is essentially to guarantee that clean hydrogen is being produced for the productive purpose, not so that you can produce, claim the credit, and create some kind of asset management strategy that way. If it's determined that the operations is wasteful, such as through venting, flared, or being used within the H2 production process itself, then that's going to be determined, that's going to essentially trigger the anti-abuse rulings. Some comments that are being explored right now is if these rules are sufficient, and also if there should be any other potential methods to ensure that you're in a utopia, your $3 per kilogram credit isn't being abused just for the sake of leveraging that economic benefit. Now, I want to point to the right of the screen here. I know that there's a lot of bar charts here. There's a lot of information. So what I'll do is I'll just kind of explain it here. This is from one of the projects that we're working on at NREL, looking at wind hybrid systems supporting industrial decarbonization. This project is specifically focusing on green steel. And so you can see within here, we have different technology years of 2025, 2030, and 2035. Within each one of these, there's different bars that are all different hybrid power plant configurations. So we've got some baselines where they're using SMR plus carbon capture, grid connected with wind, and then different variants of off-grid facilities and some semi-grid connected facilities. One thing that I wanted to point out particularly is, now I don't expect you to see this that well. However, there are some LCOH values here that are negative. Now, something that we're looking at and exploring and trying to understand from the analysis perspective is, how would an anti-abuse ruling apply here? If your LCOH value is negative, that cost delta between your produced cost and the credit, would that be essentially subtracted from your eligible credit rate or not? And so you can see for 2025, let's see. Yeah, so for 2025, within the Texas use case, which is the second from the top left, it's already reaching negative in 2025. And that's with wind, solar, and storage. And so it's really interesting to see, once this proposed guidance becomes official, what could that mean for analysis, not only for NREL, but also for deployment and deployment barriers of these facilities. Okay. So, as I mentioned, there are uncertainties, at least from NREL's perspective, with analysis for wind to hybrids. There's a lot of questions we've been asking ourselves in trying to understand, what will this mean? And what does this mean currently in between this this limbo phase of this public comment period? So as I mentioned with the anti-abuse ruling, what happens when your hydrogen values are negative? Also understanding, another big one here is the single production line, where if you have a grid connection with a facility that's semi-connected to the grid, where it prioritizes the off-grid electrons from its wind turbines or from solar, and then whenever there is a lull for whatever reason that may be, when it's pulling from the grid, now would that facility be able to claim full credit, partial credit, none, or some in between? And so that's an uncertainty that we're working with right now to understand what that could mean, because we've received internal feedback from industry that the policy can shape your operational strategy for the first 10 years as a result of the credits that you're eligible for, and how different that could look for the following 20 years once you've ran through that 10-year window effectively of these credits that you would be eligible for, whether it's your 45V, your technology neutral PTC and ITC as well, and everything in between there. Additionally, understanding what is the minimum uprated capacity requirement to satisfy additionality. From that perspective, from an economic perspective, then you have to explore whether or not it's more economical to develop an entirely new facility within your 3-year window, or if it makes more economic sense to find a facility, upgrade it by increasing the nameplate capacities. And so that's also another uncertainty. And then this was also mentioned earlier, I believe, with Tessa's presentation, but what does a battery do to satisfy the 3 pillars and to retire an EAC? Right now, we're curious to know, because within hybrids, there are a lot of different configurations you can have where you can pair solar with storage. You can pair a different configuration to satisfy your end use needs. And that's one of the benefits of having a hybrid power plant or a hybrid energy system, is that customizability. And on the contrary, due to that customizability, it can be rather challenging to figure out what is the true optimized approach to your configurations and how these credits might fit into the entire picture. And so you can see here, this is a configuration and a map that was generated within our industrial decarbonization project to understand how everything kind of fits into place with the H2 hubs, our use cases, both land-based and offshore. And so it all fits into this, and it leaves us with a lot of questions. And it's also rather exciting to see what direction this could go and what this could mean. Great. Thank you so much. I will pass it back to Belinda.
Thank you very much, Matt. Okay, so a few of the questions, we only have about 5 minutes because I am very aware that we cannot take more time as people have meetings and stuff. And thank you so much, Tessa and Tanya, for answering, as Matt was already giving his speech. And actually, a few of the questions you've already been answering as you were going. I think uncertainty is the answer to many of those, because there was precisely a question about what happens if you have a battery, and you've already answered, we don't know. So I assume that this is going to be clarified now, and it's going to be some of the cases that are going to be brought up, when the review is going on. So I just wanted to ask a few that I've marked here, but I'm going to ask 2 or 3, and then if you guys want to answer one specifically, please feel free, because there is still a lot open and we're not going to have time to do them all. So Jamie here asks about repowering wind turbines, whether they count with incrementality. I think this is a very good question, because there is a lot of solar parks that are must be coming out to the end and they need to be repowered. So do we know? Anyone can answer this question?
So I'll take a first stab at this really quick. We want to, from our perspective, from the analysis perspective, we think yes. Now, we don't know what the details or what the requirements will be if there is a minimum repowering or uprating requirement. And so what we've been doing is, and this is essentially going to be an answer that applies to a lot of these uncertainties, is what we do is we try to apply precedents. So how policy in the past has been, that's what we're going to follow unless explicitly stated otherwise or requested.
Within the guidance, there's an 80-20 rule. So as long as 80% of new investment to a facility is what constitutes the total value of that facility, then that can qualify within that 3-year window of when new clean generation must have been produced, even if the original placed in service date has been years before.
Okay, so 80-20. Does that mean you can consider 80% of that power as to be?
More of the, essentially, how much new capital expenditure are you putting towards investing in the facility? If that makes up a total of then 80% of the fair market value of the facility, then as the guidance is currently written, that may qualify. But I do believe, kind of in keeping with Matthew's point, that this is a open question of interpretation as well as feedback that Treasury is seeking.
Okay, that's excellent. There's one here about the methane hydrogen. I think, Tanya, you kind of touched upon this several times. The question is, would methane destruction be included for hydrogen production using pyrolysis of biomass waste, or otherwise would emit methane into the atmosphere? I mean, we were even talking about negative emissions, right, with biomethane, but now you mentioned that only the gas from waste has been included in one of the pathways and none of the other ones. So do you expect this to change, or I mean, what is the situation in that?
Well, so there are 8 pathways right now that are in the updated GREET model with the pre-programmed background information. And so for steam methane reformation and autothermal reformation, it's only landfill gas that's included. And for biomass gasification, it's only corn stover and logging residue. So if a producer has a feedstock or a technology or a combination of the two that's not included, they have to apply for a provisional emissions rate until their feedstock and technology is hopefully included in an update of the model. But for the 2024 tax year, and then before the new model, the next model comes out, they'll have to go through the provisional emissions rate process.
You have to essentially like prove so that it can be considered. Okay,
Right,
this is
and that's
changing.
exactly, and so that's the LCA modeling process. So it's doing an LCA study and coming up with an estimated CI score, and then there would be a CI report that goes along with that.
I mean, but at least you can change it, because I can tell you that in other occasions, like I don't think in Europe you have this. There was a question here that I think, I mean, I think we talked about this to death, but I think it's important because a lot of people don't understand what hourly matching means. So I don't know who wants to take this in a short fashion, and then Tessa, go right ahead, and then just pick questions, guys, and let's answer these 2-3 questions extra, and we can call it a day. Go ahead, Tessa.
So an example of what hourly matching may look like is, say I'm using exclusively solar electricity to power my electrolyzer to produce hydrogen. Only the hours in which essentially the sun is shining, producing electricity from my solar panels, are the hours in which I'm allowed to run my electrolyzer. And that happens on an hourly basis kind of throughout the year. So only when the sun's shining, producing clean electricity from solar is when I'm allowed to operate my electrolyzer. Then that's a model that is extended for different electricity generation types. So be it only when the wind's blowing, right, and the wind turbines are producing electricity is when I'm allowed to then produce hydrogen using wind power.
So what you got to think here is capacity factor is a massive deal, because if you're only using solar, then you have certain amount of hours. If you're using solar and wind, you may have more, but that is what makes it hard, in terms of capacity factor. And this is something that we have in Europe as well. Although I think going from yearly to hourly, it's like a bit of a jump. We go from monthly to hourly. Even so, everyone's complaining about it. But we do have like a provision in Europe where it says decarbonized grid. If you have a certain decarbonization reached in the grid, then those things become less important. You may not even have to do any of those things. I don't know whether that has been included, but I think it's very reasonable to say that that could be included in 45V pretty easily, because it's already got the European counterpart, and that would be something that I push for. Because if you're in something like California, where the grid is really already decarbonized, then it might not matter,
And that's a point that Treasury is seeking guidance on, of do we need to treat grids with a higher level of renewables penetration today differently?
Excellent. So it's good to hear. Okay, have you checked and picked any questions that you'd like to answer? Tanya, Matt, and also you, Tessa?
Yeah, I see one here from Carlos. Let's see here. So EACs, let's see here. Could those hydrogen EACs be traded in a book and claim fashion? That is, hydrogen EACs could be bought and claimed without the physical transport of the hydrogen. So how we're understanding this is you need your EACs for the electrons. It's not an EAC to move the hydrogen. And then I see kind of like, understanding like gray hydrogen consumer could claim that. And so it's, as far as we understand it, that's the whole point behind some of the stringent detail, is so that there isn't any incremental emissions, so to speak, so that a gray hydrogen producer can purchase EACs and then claim a credit. That's not, at least how we understand it from DOE's perspective and from the government's perspective, is that the goal is, it's very stringent just to add new capacity to support clean hydrogen production, rather than connecting to the grid, purchasing an EAC, and potentially taking these electrons that are used for residential and business purposes, such as charging your EVs, so that the electrons aren't pulled from that, and then they have to provide a backfill supply with technologies that are expensive to operate and typically aren't clean generation.
Yeah, so it's not like a sort of like carbon credit market. It's like an actual, you have to have the plant market. I think that's what they're trying to do. So Tanya, Tessa, and that'll be it because I know I'm very aware of time. So Tanya, go right ahead.
I'll jump in. So there's a question about the role of the Tesla model of building energy infrastructure to support off-takers. I think it will, so 45V is production only, and it's not, there aren't incentive. The idea is to bring down the cost, so that will increase demand. But this whole idea of building out the infrastructure to be able to support off-takers is very important. And there are some other tax credits that potentially can be utilized to help pay for that infrastructure. So I think it's going to be an important idea because that's one of the challenges of hydrogen is getting it from where it's produced to where it's used and what kind of connecting infrastructure is needed. So I think it's an excellent point and something that we should all be considering.
Thank you very much. You're right. We always forget that little detail of how to move
Right,
stuff and how
right.
to
The
store it.
connective tissue.
Teeny tiny detail. Tessa, do you have any questions you'd like to answer before we go?
I think we're good to wrap.
Okay, so thank you very much, guys. Thank you, Tessa. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Matt. I think it's been a very, very interesting session, and I think I've learned a great deal actually as well on top of all of the other sessions that I had done before, because you got me thinking in a very different way about this. I can't wait to hear about how it develops, and we'll do another event at some point like this, to analyze how it ends up. My understanding is we have to wait a few months, but I encourage you all to go out and also make yourself heard, because this is time where there is a period where you can also give in, and talk about your challenges so that they're considered. And without further ado, thank you very much and see you next time. Thank you.